After losing my marriage, my house, and my career to my ex-husband's betrayal, I took a job cleaning offices at night. The twist? It was his company. 3 months into scrubbing floors where I once walked in designer heels, I found a hidden safe behind his executive desk. What was inside didn't just expose his lies, it gave me the power to destroy everything he'd stolen from me.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I pushed my cleaning cart down the marble hallway of Brooks and Associates Financial Services. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now mopping the same floors where I'd once commanded respect as a senior financial advisor. 6 months ago, I was Ariel Jerome, wearing $1,000 suits and managing multi-million-dollar portfolios. Tonight, I was just another invisible woman in a gray uniform, armed with disinfectant and a mop bucket. The security guard, Philip Willard, barely looked up from his crossword puzzle as I signed in at 11 p.m. He'd worked here for 15 years, had seen me rise through the ranks, had even congratulated me on my promotion to senior advisor 3 years ago. Now, he treated me like furniture, present but unworthy of acknowledgement. It was amazing how quickly respect evaporated when your title disappeared. "Evening, Mrs. Jerome," he mumbled, not bothering to correct himself to my maiden name, Rowan, which I'd reclaimed after the divorce. Old habits, I supposed. Or maybe it was his way of reminding me what I'd lost. "Evening, Philip," I replied, my voice steady despite the knot in my throat that appeared every time someone used that name. The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt like ascending to a different planet, one where my former life existed in photographs and achievements I could no longer claim. The doors opened with a soft ding, revealing the executive wing, where corner offices looked out over the city skyline, where Bradley Jerome, my ex-husband and the company's golden boy, now occupied what should have been my office. I'd worked at Brooks and Associates for 8 years, climbing from junior analyst to senior advisor through sheer determination and skill. I'd brought in some of their biggest clients, developed innovative investment strategies that saved the firm millions, and mentored younger staff members who now wouldn't meet my eyes in the rare moments our paths crossed during shift changes. Bradley had been my colleague first, then my husband, then my destroyer. We'd met during my second year at the firm, both ambitious young professionals burning the midnight oil to prove ourselves. He was charming, intelligent, and seemed to appreciate my drive rather than feel threatened by it. We were the power couple of Brooks and Associates, until I discovered he'd been systematically stealing my ideas, my clients, and eventually my entire future. The divorce had been swift and brutal. Bradley's lawyer, paid for by the firm, naturally, had somehow convinced the judge that my contributions to our joint accounts were minimal compared to his salary increases over the years. Never mind that those salary increases came from strategies I'd developed. Never mind that the clients he'd stolen from me were ones I'd cultivated for years. The prenup I'd naively signed in the glow of new love protected his assets while leaving me with nearly nothing. Channing Brooks, the company's founder and Bradley's mentor, had made it clear which side the firm would support. There was talk of ethical violations when I tried to contest Bradley's theft of my work. Suddenly, client complaints appeared in my file, complaints I'd never heard of, from people who'd previously sung my praises. My access to sensitive information was restricted. Meetings happened without me. Within 3 months, I was given the choice to resign gracefully or be terminated for cause. I chose resignation, thinking I could land somewhere else quickly, but Bradley had been busy. My industry reputation, carefully built over 8 years, crumbled overnight. Former colleagues wouldn't return my calls. Job interviews ended abruptly when they called Brooks and Associates for references. The financial industry was smaller than most people realized, and Bradley had poisoned every well I might have drawn from. By month 4 of unemployment, I'd lost the house. Our house, technically his house, according to the divorce decree. I moved into a studio apartment in a neighborhood where sirens were the dominant soundtrack. My savings evaporated on legal fees and basic survival. My car was repossessed, my credit cards were maxed out and then canceled. I sold my jewelry, my furniture, anything of value until I owned nothing but a suitcase of clothes and a stubborn refusal to give up. The cleaning job came through a temp agency that didn't do background checks beyond criminal history. Night shift at various office buildings, including, through either cosmic irony or deliberate cruelty, Brooks and Associates. When I saw the assignment, I almost turned it down. Almost. But pride was a luxury I could no longer afford, and the pay was better than retail work that would have me competing with teenagers for hours. So here I was, 3 months into my new career as a ghost haunting my former life. I cleaned the conference rooms where I'd once presented to boards of directors. I emptied wastebaskets that contained the financial reports I'd once authored. I vacuumed the office where Bradley now sat behind the mahogany desk that should have been mine, surrounded by awards that bore his name but contained my work. The other cleaning staff, Ella Ackles and Sienna Willard, Philip's daughter, who'd taken the job to help pay for nursing school, treated me with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. They knew I was different, overqualified, probably hiding from something, but they were kind in the way that working-class people often were to others who'd fallen from grace. They shared coffee during breaks, offered advice about which cleaning supplies worked best, and never asked probing questions about my past. Tonight felt different, though. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that something was about to shift. As I pushed my cart past the reception area where I'd once been greeted by name, past the cubicles where former colleagues had worked late into the night alongside me, toward the executive wing where my dreams had died, I felt a strange anticipation building in my chest. Bradley's office door stood closed, as it always did when he wasn't there. But tonight, as I inserted my master key and stepped inside, I noticed something that made me pause. The heavy wooden bookshelf behind his desk, the one that held his Harvard MBA diploma and various industry awards, was slightly askew. Not enough for most people to notice, but I'd spent enough time in this office during our marriage to know every detail of its layout. As I moved closer to straighten it, running my fingers along the edge where it met the wall, I felt something give way. A hidden mechanism, perhaps, or a loose panel. The bookshelf shifted under slight pressure, revealing a gap between it and the wall, and behind that gap, the dull gleam of a metal safe built into the wall itself. My heart began to pound as I stared at this secret compartment that Bradley had somehow installed without anyone knowing. What could be so important, so sensitive, that he'd hidden it behind a bookshelf in his office? What secrets was he keeping that required this level of concealment? As I stood there in the dim light of his office, holding my breath and listening to the building's late-night silence, I realized that everything was about to change. The woman who'd lost everything was about to discover what her ex-husband had been hiding all along. And something told me it was going to be worth more than everything I'd lost. But to understand how I'd fallen this far, how a woman who once managed $100 million portfolios ended up scrubbing toilets in her own former workplace, I need to take you back to the beginning. Back to when I believed in hard work, loyalty, and the naive idea that talent would always be rewarded. I'd started at Brooks & Associates 8 years ago as a junior analyst, fresh out of graduate school with my MBA in finance and a mountain of student debt that made my monthly payments feel like mortgage payments. The firm occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown tower, and walking through those glass doors on my first day felt like stepping into my future. Channing Brooks had built the company from nothing 25 years earlier, starting with a single office and a handful of middle-class clients who trusted him with their retirement savings. By the time I arrived, Brooks & Associates managed over $2 billion in assets and employed 43 people across departments, ranging from wealth management to corporate restructuring. My desk was in the bullpen, a sea of cubicles where junior staff members worked under fluorescent lights that hummed constantly and made everyone look slightly green. But I loved it. I loved the energy, the conversations about market trends that carried across the cubicle walls, the sense that every day brought new challenges to solve and opportunities to prove myself. My first supervisor was Ian Ackles, a 20-year veteran who'd worked his way up from the mailroom to senior advisor. Ian had the patience of a saint and the ability to explain complex financial concepts in ways that made sense to both clients and confused junior staff. He took me under his wing immediately, perhaps recognizing something of his younger self in my eagerness to learn. The numbers tell stories, he told me during my second week as we reviewed a client's portfolio that had been underperforming for months. But you have to listen carefully to hear what they're really saying. Anyone can read a profit and loss statement. The skill is understanding what the patterns mean for the future.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I absorbed everything Ian taught me like a sponge. I stayed late to study client files, arrived early to prepare for meetings, and spent my weekends reading financial journals and industry publications. While my colleagues grabbed drinks after work or spent their evenings watching television, I was building financial models and analyzing market trends. The breakthrough came during my 6th month when I identified a pattern in the tech sector that everyone else had missed. Small biotechnology companies were being systematically undervalued by traditional metrics because analysts weren't accounting for their intellectual property portfolios. I spent 3 weeks building a new valuation model that incorporated patent strength and research pipeline depth. When I presented my findings to Ian, he stared at the spreadsheets for a full 5 minutes without speaking. Then he asked me to walk him through the analysis step by step. Then he asked me to present it to the senior partners. Ariel, Channing Brooks said after my presentation, his weathered hands clasped on the conference table, this is exactly the kind of forward-thinking analysis that sets us apart from our competitors. How quickly can you apply this model to our existing biotech holdings? Within a month, my recommendations had generated a 12% return for clients invested in the sector. Within 6 months, I'd been promoted to analyst with my own small roster of accounts. Within a year, I had my own office. Not in the executive wing, but a real office with walls and a door and a window that looked out over the city. That's when I met Bradley. He joined the firm 2 months after my promotion, hired as a senior analyst with impressive credentials from a competing firm in Chicago. Where I was methodical and research-driven, Bradley was charismatic and intuitive. Where I spent hours building financial models, he seemed to sense market movements through some combination of instinct and charm that I found both fascinating and slightly infuriating. Our first real conversation happened during a client meeting that went sideways, when the client, a nervous retiree named Mrs. Patterson, became confused about the risk levels in her portfolio. I'd spent 20 minutes explaining the mathematics of diversification when Bradley leaned forward and said, "Mrs. Patterson, think of your investments like a garden. You wouldn't plant only roses, would you? You'd want some sturdy oak trees, maybe some fast-growing flowers, and definitely some vegetables you could count on for dinner." Mrs. Patterson's face lit up with understanding. "Oh, like not putting all my eggs in one basket, but with flowers?" "Exactly," Bradley smiled, "and Ariel here is the expert gardener who makes sure everything grows beautifully together." After the meeting, as we walked back to our offices, I found myself studying Bradley's profile. That was brilliant, I admitted. I was losing her completely. "You weren't losing her," he replied. "You were just speaking a different language. Your analysis was perfect. She just needed it translated into something familiar." That conversation marked the beginning of our partnership, both professional and personal. We discovered we complemented each other perfectly. My analytical skills provided the foundation for investment strategies, while his communication abilities made complex concepts accessible to clients. We began collaborating on presentations, sharing client meetings, and developing a reputation as the dynamic duo of Brooks and Associates. The romance developed gradually, built on late nights working together and shared ambitions for our careers. Bradley would bring me coffee during marathon research sessions. I would help him prepare for client presentations by role-playing difficult questions. We celebrated each other's successes and commiserated over setbacks. Our colleagues noticed before we did. "You two are like an old married couple," Sienna would tease when she brought files to my office and found Bradley there, both of us hunched over spreadsheets finishing each other's sentences. The first time Bradley kissed me was during the company Christmas party, 2 years into our partnership. We'd been working on a particularly complex merger analysis and had stayed late to finish the presentation for Monday morning. The office was empty except for the cleaning crew, and snow was falling outside my window. "We make a good team," he said, looking up from his laptop. "The best," I agreed, then looked up to find him watching me with an expression I hadn't seen before. "Ariel," he said softly, and I knew everything was about to change. Our wedding 18 months later was the social event of the Brooks and Associates calendar. Channing Brooks himself officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. Our colleagues filled the church, our clients sent gifts, and for one perfect day, I felt like I was living in a fairy tale where hard work and true love conquered everything. We bought a house in the suburbs with a 2-car garage and a mortgage that stretched our budget but felt manageable with our combined incomes. We adopted a golden retriever named Porter, who had the unfortunate habit of chewing expensive shoes. We hosted dinner parties where we served wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget and talked about market trends until our non-finance friends' eyes glazed over. But even during those golden years, there were signs I chose to ignore. Bradley's ideas began sounding strangely similar to concepts I'd developed months earlier. Clients I'd cultivated for years began requesting meetings with him specifically. My name appeared less frequently on successful project reports, while his appeared more often. I attributed it to his natural charisma, his ability to make clients feel comfortable and confident. I told myself that success was a team effort, that individual recognition mattered less than our shared achievements. I believed in our partnership, in our marriage, in the future we were building together. I had no idea that while I was building our life, he was systematically dismantling my career. To understand how completely Bradley destroyed me, you need to understand the ecosystem at Brooks and Associates, the delicate web of relationships, favors, and unspoken hierarchies that determined who rose and who fell. It was a world where perception mattered more than performance, where the right mentor could elevate you beyond your abilities, and where the wrong enemy could bury you despite your talents. At the top of this food chain sat Channing Brooks himself, now 67 years old with silver hair that he kept precisely trimmed and a wardrobe of custom suits that probably cost more than most people's cars. Channing had built his empire through a combination of genuine financial acumen and an almost supernatural ability to read people. He could spot a client's insecurities within minutes of meeting them and craft investment strategies that made them feel both secure and sophisticated. But Channing's greatest skill wasn't managing money, it was managing people. He had an uncanny ability to identify which employees had the potential to generate revenue and which ones were simply competent worker bees. He cultivated the revenue generators like prize orchids, giving them choice assignments, introducing them to his network of high net worth contacts, and gradually increasing their compensation until they were completely dependent on his favor. The worker bees, meanwhile, were kept content with steady paychecks and the illusion of job security, never quite given enough responsibility or recognition to threaten the established order. It was a brilliant system that ensured loyalty from both groups. The stars competed for his attention, while the support staff remained grateful for stability. Eric Willard served as Channing's right hand and the firm's chief operating officer. Where Channing was charismatic and visionary, Eric was methodical and ruthless. He handled the unpleasant aspects of running the business, firing underperformers, negotiating contracts, and dealing with regulatory compliance. Eric had been with the firm for 15 years, having joined as a senior accountant and worked his way up through sheer competence and an apparent lack of personal ambition that made him non-threatening to Channing's leadership. Eric's office sat directly across from Channing's, connected by a door that was almost always open during business hours. Their relationship reminded me of a medieval king and his most trusted advisor. Eric anticipated Channing's needs, executed his decisions, and served as a buffer between the founder and the day-to-day frustrations of running a growing business. The senior partners formed the next tier of power. There were 5 of them, each managing their own division and responsible for generating a specific portion of the firm's revenue. They met with Channing every Monday morning in the executive conference room. their voices carrying through the thick walls as they discussed client acquisitions, market strategies, and personnel decisions that would determine the careers of everyone beneath them. Ian Ackles was the most senior of these partners, having earned his position through 20 years of steady performance and an almost supernatural ability to calm nervous clients. Ian managed the Wealth Preservation Division, working primarily with retirees and inheritance cases. Not the most glamorous work, but incredibly stable and profitable. He was universally respected by the staff, known for his fairness and his willingness to mentor younger employees. Jasmine Brooks, Channing's daughter, occupied a more complicated position in the hierarchy. She'd joined the firm straight out of law school 5 years earlier and had quickly established herself as competent but not exceptional. Jasmine handled estate planning and corporate structuring, work that required meticulous attention to detail and a thorough understanding of tax law. Her relationship with her father was professionally cordial but personally distant. She called him Mr. Brooks during business hours and seemed determined to prove that her position was earned rather than inherited. The other senior partners were specialists: corporate restructuring, international investments, and high-risk venture capital. Each had carved out their own niche and maintained their own fiefdom within the larger organization. They competed with each other for resources and recognition, but the competition remained civil because they all understood that their individual success depended on the firm's overall prosperity. Bradley had positioned himself brilliantly within this structure from the moment he arrived. Rather than competing directly with the established senior staff, he had focused on making himself indispensable to Channing personally. He volunteered for projects that brought him face-to-face with the founder, stayed late to prepare presentations that impressed major clients, and demonstrated an almost psychic ability to anticipate what Channing wanted to hear in meetings. Within 6 months of joining the firm, Bradley was attending client dinners that typically included only senior partners. Within a year, he was traveling with Channing to industry conferences and networking events. By the time we got married, Bradley had secured something more valuable than a promotion. He had gained Channing's personal trust and attention. I watched this cultivation with admiration rather than suspicion. Bradley was ambitious, certainly, but ambition was hardly unusual in our industry. I assumed his rising status would benefit both of us, that our partnership would continue to thrive as his influence within the firm grew. I failed to recognize that Bradley's strategy required him to distinguish himself not just from his peers, but from his wife. The first subtle sign came during our second year of marriage when Bradley began attending certain meetings without me. "Channing wants to keep this small," he would explain, or "this is more of a strategic planning session." I accepted these explanations because they seemed reasonable and because I trusted him completely. The second sign was more troubling, but equally easy to rationalize. My direct access to Channing became increasingly rare. Where I had once been invited to present my analyses to the founder personally, those opportunities began flowing through Bradley instead. "He thinks it's more efficient to have a single point of contact for our projects," Bradley explained when I questioned the change. The third sign should have been impossible to miss, but love has a remarkable ability to obscure obvious truths. My best ideas, the insights that had built my reputation within the firm, began appearing in Bradley's presentations to senior management. When I confronted him about this, he seemed genuinely confused by my concern. "We're a team, Ariel," he said, his voice carrying a tone of gentle correction. "Your analysis, my presentation skills, that's how we've always worked. Besides, does it really matter who gets the credit, as long as we're both succeeding?" At the time, his response seemed reasonable. We were married, after all. We shared everything. Why not share professional recognition? I told myself that strong marriages required compromise, that my ego was less important than our collective success. I failed to understand that in the ecosystem of Brooks and Associates, credit was currency, and Bradley was systematically bankrupting my account while enriching his own. Every idea he presented without acknowledging my contribution strengthened his position while weakening mine. Every client relationship he claimed credit for developing made him more valuable to the firm while making me more expendable. By the time I realized what was happening, Bradley had accumulated enough political capital to survive the coming storm. I, meanwhile, had been reduced to little more than an invisible research assistant in the eyes of the people who mattered. The trap had been set with surgical precision, and I had helped him build it with my own naive trust. The changes began so subtly that I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. It started with small shifts in routine, barely noticeable alterations to patterns that had defined our work life for years. Bradley began staying later at the office, claiming he was working on special projects that required absolute confidentiality. When I offered to help, he would smile and kiss my forehead like I was a child offering to assist with adult responsibilities. "This one's a bit sensitive," he would say, his hand already reaching for his briefcase. "Channing wants to keep the circle small until we're ready to present to the full partnership." The special projects seemed to multiply. Bradley's calendar filled with meetings marked only as strategic planning or confidential client consultation. When I asked about them over dinner, he would offer vague responses about exploring new market opportunities or developing innovative investment vehicles. His explanations always sounded plausible, but they left me feeling strangely excluded from work that had once been our shared passion. Our Tuesday morning coffee meetings, a tradition we'd maintained since we first started collaborating, began to feel different. Where we had once spent an hour discussing market trends and client strategies, Bradley now seemed distracted, checking his phone frequently and offering responses that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. "Have you seen the volatility in the energy sector?" I asked during one of these increasingly uncomfortable sessions. Bradley looked up from his phone, blinking as if he'd forgotten I was there. "Oh, yes, very volatile. We should definitely keep an eye on that." It was the kind of non-answer that would have been unthinkable during our early partnership, when we could spend hours dissecting a single market movement from every possible angle. Now it felt like he was humoring me, going through the motions of our professional relationship while his real attention was focused elsewhere. The exclusion from meetings became more pronounced. Channing's assistant, Camilla Rowan, had always copied me on invitations to senior staff meetings where my expertise might be relevant. Suddenly, those invitations stopped coming. When I mentioned this to Bradley, he shrugged it off with an explanation that made me feel petty for even noticing. "They're trying to streamline communication," he said, not looking up from the financial reports he was reviewing. "Too many people in meetings makes decision-making inefficient. You know how Channing feels about wasted time." But I had worked with Channing for 8 years. I knew his management style, his preferences, his pet peeves. Efficiency mattered to him, certainly, but so did having access to the best analysis and insights his staff could provide. The idea that he would suddenly decide my input was unnecessary contradicted everything I knew about how he operated. I began to notice changes in how our colleagues interacted with me. Conversations that had once included me naturally began to feel forced when I joined them. People who had sought out my opinions on market trends started directing those same questions to Bradley instead. It was subtle, a slight turn of the body away from me during group discussions, eye contact that lasted a fraction of a second less than usual, but unmistakable once I started paying attention. The most troubling change was in my relationship with our clients. For 3 years, I had been the primary analyst for several major accounts, building relationships through careful attention to their individual needs and circumstances. Mrs. Henley, whose deceased husband's pension I had restructured to provide her with stable income, began asking specifically for Bradley during our quarterly reviews. "He has such a wonderful way of explaining things," she told me, during what would be our final one-on-one meeting. "I feel so much more confident when he walks me through the numbers." Mr. Davidson, whose small business I had helped expand through careful cash flow management, made a similar request. "Bradley suggested some fascinating new strategies during our last conversation," he said, as if that conversation had happened without me, despite the fact that I had prepared all the analysis he was referring to. The pattern became undeniable when the Clearwater Group, a nonprofit organization whose endowment I had been managing for 2 years, formally requested that Bradley be assigned as their primary contact. The request came through Eric Willard's office, typed on official letterhead and signed by their board chairman. The board feels that Mr. Jerome's vision for innovative investment strategies aligns more closely with our long-term goals, the letter stated, as if the innovative strategies they were praising hadn't originated from months of my research into socially responsible investment vehicles. When I confronted Bradley about this, his response revealed a calculated coldness I had never seen before. Maybe they just respond better to my communication style, he said, his voice carrying a hint of impatience. Not everyone appreciates your analytical approach. Some clients need more hand-holding, more emotional connection. The implication stung worse than an outright insult. He was suggesting that my strength, thorough, methodical analysis, was actually a weakness in client relationships. More damaging, he was implying that his success with these clients was due to superior social skills rather than superior research that I had provided. I started keeping a private record of these incidents, not because I suspected deliberate sabotage, I wasn't ready to believe that yet, but because I needed to understand whether the pattern was real or imagined. In a small notebook I kept locked in my desk drawer, I documented each meeting I was excluded from, each client interaction that felt different, each conversation that left me feeling diminished. The notebook filled with entries faster than I had expected. March 15th, Bradley presented my analysis of semiconductor trends to the Brennan account without mentioning my involvement. When Mrs. Brennan complimented the insight, he accepted credit fully. March 22, Camilla mentioned that the Senior Partners Retreat agenda included discussion of my cryptocurrency research, but I wasn't invited to present it personally. March 29, found out through Ian that Bradley has been having private dinner meetings with our 3 largest clients. When asked, he said it was relationship maintenance that didn't require analytical support. Each entry felt like a small betrayal, but taken together, they painted a picture that I was still too emotionally invested to see clearly. Bradley wasn't just succeeding, he was succeeding by erasing my contributions to that success. The breaking point came during the quarterly performance review. Channing's office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and antique mahogany furniture, had always felt like a sanctuary where hard work was recognized and rewarded. I had received glowing reviews there for 3 consecutive years, praise that translated into salary increases and expanded responsibilities. This time felt different from the moment I sat down. Channing's usual warmth seemed tempered by something I couldn't identify. Not coldness exactly, but a professional distance that hadn't existed in our previous meetings. "Ariel," he began, his hands folded on the leather desk pad, "you've been with us for 8 years now. You've shown consistent competence in your analytical work." Competence, not excellence, not innovation, not the forward-thinking insights he had praised so enthusiastically in previous years. Competence, the kind of tepid praise reserved for employees who met basic expectations without exceeding them. "However," he continued, "we've noticed that your client interaction scores have been inconsistent. Several accounts have requested different handling approaches." I felt my stomach drop as he continued, outlining feedback that painted me as technically skilled but lacking in the interpersonal abilities that drove client satisfaction. Every criticism felt like a distorted reflection of my actual strengths, twisted to sound like professional inadequacies. As I walked back to my office afterward, my hands shaking slightly from the combination of adrenaline and confusion, I realized that something fundamental had changed. The question was no longer whether I was imagining the shifts in my professional relationships. The question was whether I could figure out what was happening before it destroyed everything I had worked to build. The truth came to me in pieces, like a puzzle I'd been solving unconsciously for months. It started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to overhear and ended with the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my career, and my future. I had stayed late to finish a comprehensive analysis of emerging markets for the Henderson Group, one of our most conservative clients who was considering diversifying their portfolio. The office was quiet except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of the cleaning crew working on the lower floors. I was deep in research when I heard voices coming from Bradley's office next door, his voice and another voice I couldn't immediately identify. The conversation was muffled by the wall between our offices, but something about the tone made me pause. There was an urgency, an intimacy to their discussion that seemed inappropriate for a business meeting at 9 o'clock at night. I moved closer to the shared wall, pressing my ear against the cool plaster like a character in a spy novel. "She's getting suspicious," Bradley was saying, his voice clearer now, "asking too many questions about the client transfers. Then we need to accelerate the timeline." The second voice belonged to Camilla, Channing's assistant. But why would she be having a private meeting with my husband about client transfers? "The Brennan documentation is ready," Camilla continued. "All we need is her signature on the transition papers, and the account officially moves under your management." My blood turned to ice water as the implications became clear. They were discussing my accounts, the clients I'd spent years cultivating, the relationships I'd built through countless hours of careful analysis and personal attention. They were planning to transfer them away from me, and they needed my signature to make it legal. "What about the Henderson Group?" Bradley asked. "That account alone is worth $2 million in annual fees." "Already handled." Channing signed off on the reassignment this afternoon. Something about Ariel's analytical approach being too rigid for their evolving needs. I stumbled backward from the wall, my hand pressed to my mouth to stifle the sound of my own breathing. The Henderson Group, the analysis I was working on at that very moment, had already been taken away from me. I was preparing research for an account that was no longer mine, investing my expertise in work that would benefit the man who was stealing my career. "She's going to fight this," Bradley said, and for a moment I heard something that might have been regret in his voice. "Ariel's not stupid once she realizes what's happening." "Let her fight," Camilla interrupted. "We have documentation of client complaints about her communication style. We have performance reviews showing declining interpersonal effectiveness. By the time she figures out how to respond, there won't be anything left to fight for." Client complaints that I'd never heard about, performance reviews that painted me as professionally inadequate despite years of success. They had been building a case against me, manufacturing evidence of poor performance while simultaneously stealing the work that had made me valuable to the firm. I slipped back to my desk, my legs shaking so badly I could barely walk. With trembling fingers, I opened my email and began scrolling through months of correspondence, looking for signs of the conspiracy that had apparently been unfolding around me. The evidence was there, once I knew what to look for. Meetings scheduled without me, client communications that excluded my input, strategic decisions made about my accounts without my knowledge. But it was the personal betrayal that cut deepest. Bradley, the man I'd shared my bed with, my dreams with, my most vulnerable professional insecurities with, had been systematically destroying my career while I slept beside him each night. Every kiss, every "how was your day," every intimate conversation about our shared future had been lies, calculated performances designed to keep me docile while he dismantled my professional life. I printed everything: emails, client files, performance reviews, anything that might serve as evidence of what had been done to me. My hands moved automatically while my mind struggled to process the magnitude of the betrayal. This wasn't just professional sabotage, it was the complete violation of every trust I'd placed in the person I loved most. The office had grown completely quiet by the time I finished gathering documents. Bradley and Camilla had left through the executive entrance while I was working, probably assuming I would continue my research in blissful ignorance until the morning brought the official news of my professional execution. I drove home in a daze, my briefcase full of evidence sitting like a time bomb on the passenger seat. Our house looked exactly the same as it had that morning, the same Tudor Revival architecture, the same carefully maintained landscaping, the same BMW in the driveway. But everything had changed. This wasn't my home anymore. It was the lair of someone who had been systematically destroying my life. Bradley was waiting in the kitchen, a glass of wine in his hand and a smile on his face that now looked like a mask. "How was your evening?" he asked, the same question he'd asked hundreds of times before. But tonight, I knew the answer would destroy us both. I didn't confront Bradley that night. Instead, I played the role of the oblivious wife, kissing him goodnight and lying awake beside him until dawn, planning my next moves with the cold calculation of someone who had finally understood the rules of the game being played against her. The official announcement came 3 days later during what Eric Willard called an organizational restructuring meeting. The entire staff was crammed into the main conference room, the air thick with nervous energy and the kind of anticipation that preceded either promotions or layoffs. I sat in my usual seat, directly across from where Bradley had positioned himself near the front, close to Channing's right hand. As Brooks and Associates continues to grow and evolve, Channing began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had delivered difficult news many times before, we must ensure our client service model remains both efficient and effective. The corporate speak felt like fingernails on a chalkboard, each euphemism another layer of polish on what I knew would be my professional burial. To that end, we're implementing a new centralized account management structure. Senior staff members with demonstrated leadership capabilities will take primary responsibility for our most important client relationships, while our analytical team will provide research support across all accounts. My stomach dropped as the implications became clear. They weren't just stealing my clients, they were demoting me to a support role, reducing me from a trusted advisor to an invisible researcher whose work would be filtered through others before reaching the people I had served for years. Bradley Jerome will assume primary responsibility for the Henderson Group, the Brennan Foundation, and the Clearwater nonprofit accounts, Eric continued, reading from a prepared statement with all the warmth of a tax document. These transitions will begin immediately to ensure continuity of service. Around the conference table, my colleagues avoided eye contact, their discomfort palpable. Ian Ackles, who had mentored me for years, stared at his hands with an expression of barely controlled anger. Jasmine Brooks looked genuinely surprised, her eyebrows raised as if this reorganization was news to her as well. But it was Camilla's reaction that confirmed everything I suspected. She sat near the back of the room, her face carefully neutral, but I caught the small, satisfied smile that played at the corners of her mouth when Bradley's name was announced. She knew. She had helped orchestrate this. Ariel will continue in her analytical role, Eric added, as if my career trajectory was an afterthought, providing research support to ensure our enhanced service model has access to the highest quality market intelligence. Research support. After 8 years of building relationships, managing accounts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and generating revenue that helped build the firm's reputation, I was being reduced to a research assistant whose work would be attributed to others. The meeting continued with details about transition timelines and client communication strategies, but I barely heard the words. I was watching Bradley, studying the man I had loved and trusted, looking for any sign of guilt or regret in his carefully composed features. There was none. He nodded at appropriate moments, asked thoughtful questions about implementation logistics, and played the role of the grateful employee being rewarded for his dedication. When Eric mentioned the substantial salary increase that would accompany Bradley's new responsibilities, an increase funded presumably by the accounts he was inheriting from me, he maintained the perfect expression of humble gratitude. After the meeting, as staff members filed out in clusters of whispered conversations, Bradley approached my chair with what appeared to be genuine concern. "I know this feels like a big change," he said, his voice pitched low so others wouldn't overhear. "But I think it could be really good for us. Less client-facing pressure for you, more time to focus on the analytical work you love." The analytical work I love, as if my passion for research negated my ability to maintain client relationships, as if being reduced to an invisible support role was some kind of professional gift rather than career assassination. "I'm sure you'll do wonderfully with the Henderson Group," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "You'll have access to all my research on their risk tolerance and investment preferences." "Of course," Bradley replied, and for just a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not guilt exactly, but a wariness, as if he was trying to gauge how much I suspected. "Your insights will be invaluable as I take over the relationship." Take over the relationship. Not continue it, not build upon it, but take it over completely, as if the years I'd spent earning Mrs. Henderson's trust and understanding her late husband's vision for their family's financial security were simply assets to be transferred like office equipment. That afternoon, I received the formal transition documents, pages of legal language that essentially required me to hand over every aspect of my client relationships to Bradley. Contact information, meeting notes, personal preferences, investment histories, even copies of birthday cards I'd sent and thank you notes I'd received. Everything that made these relationships personal and meaningful was to be systematized, documented, and transferred to someone who saw them as stepping stones to his own advancement. The most insulting part was the signature line at the bottom, where I was expected to acknowledge that this transition was in the best interests of both the clients and the firm, as if I was voluntarily surrendering my life's work for the greater good rather than being systematically stripped of everything I'd built. I signed the documents with a steady hand, but I didn't submit them immediately. Instead, I made copies of everything: the client files, the transition paperwork, the organizational chart that showed my new diminished role in the company hierarchy. Evidence for the war I was finally ready to fight. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to treat me like an invisible support staff member, then invisible I would become. But invisibility, I was about to discover, could be a weapon more powerful than any direct confrontation. Sometimes the best revenge comes from letting people think they've already won. The handover process was designed to be thorough, clinical, and humiliating. Over the course of 2 weeks, I was required to sit in a series of meetings where I essentially trained my replacement, my own husband, to take over relationships I had spent years cultivating. Each session felt like performing surgery on myself without anesthesia. Mrs. Henderson prefers morning meetings, I explained to Bradley as we sat in conference room B, client files spread between us like evidence in a trial. Never before 10, though. Her arthritis makes early mornings difficult. Bradley took notes with the diligence of a graduate student, writing down details that I had internalized through dozens of conversations and careful observation. "What about communication preferences?" he asked. "Email, phone calls, in-person meetings?" She likes to see documents in hard copy first, then we discuss them over coffee. She processes information better when she can hold it in her hands. I paused, remembering the widow's slight tremor when she was nervous, the way she would smooth the papers with her palm when considering difficult decisions. She'll need reassurance during market volatility. Her husband handled all their investments before he died, so major changes make her anxious. Each detail I shared felt like giving away pieces of my professional soul. These weren't just client preferences, they were insights earned through genuine human connection, understanding developed through years of patient relationship building. Bradley was receiving a roadmap to success that he had neither earned nor truly understood. The most painful part was watching him miss the deeper implications of what I was telling him. When I explained that Mr. Davidson always brought photos of his grandchildren to our quarterly meetings, Bradley wrote down, "Client brings family photos," as if it were a quirky habit rather than a window into the man's deepest motivation for building wealth. "He's not just investing for returns," I tried to explain. "He's building a legacy. Every investment decision should be framed in terms of what he's leaving for his family." Right, Bradley nodded, but I could see he was thinking about portfolio performance metrics rather than the emotional foundations that drove client loyalty. The transition meetings revealed something I had never fully appreciated: the vast difference between managing accounts and nurturing relationships. Bradley was receiving all the technical information, risk tolerance assessments, investment histories, performance benchmarks, but he was missing the human intelligence that transformed good service into exceptional service. This realization sparked an idea that would ultimately save me, though I didn't recognize it at the time. As I prepared my final client files, I began creating 2 versions of each account summary. The official version contained all the information I was required to transfer: contact details, financial data, meeting schedules, documented preferences. But I also created personal files that contained the real intelligence, the unspoken concerns, the family dynamics that influenced decisions, the personal stories that had built trust between my clients and me. Mrs. Henderson's official file noted that she was a conservative investor with a focus on income generation. My personal file recorded that she still kept her deceased husband's reading glasses on her desk and made investment decisions based on what she thought he would have wanted. It included the anniversary of his death, when she would need extra emotional support, and the names of her 3 cats, who were essentially her adopted children. Mr. Davidson's official file showed a moderate risk tolerance with quarterly review preferences. My personal notes detailed his immigrant background, his pride in building his construction business from nothing, and his deep-seated fear that economic downturns could destroy everything he had worked to achieve. I knew which of his grandchildren were applying to college, which ones showed artistic talent, and how those factors influenced his long-term financial planning. The Clearwater Group's official file contained standard nonprofit investment guidelines. My private notes included the founder's vision for expanding their scholarship program, the board politics that sometimes complicated decision-making, and the seasonal cash flow patterns that affected their investment timing. I compiled these personal insights into what I privately called my Relationship Bible, a leather-bound notebook that contained the human stories behind every account I was losing. It wasn't technically proprietary information, since none of it appeared in official client files, but it represented years of careful observation and genuine caring that couldn't be transferred through corporate documentation. On my final day managing these accounts, I scheduled what I told Bradley were goodbye meetings with each client. In reality, these were sessions where I planned to ensure continuity of care while subtly establishing ongoing connections that would survive the transition. I wanted to personally introduce you to Bradley Jerome, who will be taking over your account management, I told Mrs. Henderson during our final official meeting. He's extremely capable and will have access to all your investment history and preferences. But will he understand about Harold? Mrs. Henderson asked quietly, referring to her deceased husband. Will he know that every decision we make needs to honor what Harold would have wanted? I glanced at Bradley, who looked uncomfortable with the emotional dimension of the question. Bradley is very knowledgeable about investment strategies, I said carefully, and if you ever need someone to talk through the more personal aspects of your financial planning, I hope you'll feel comfortable calling me directly. It was a subtle offer, barely a suggestion, but Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up with understanding. You mean if I have questions about things that go beyond just numbers and charts? Exactly, I smiled. Some conversations require a different kind of expertise. I had similar exchanges with each of my former clients, planting seeds for future contact while maintaining perfect professional propriety. I wasn't actively sabotaging Bradley's transition, I was simply ensuring that the human relationships I had built wouldn't disappear entirely when the account management changed hands. By the time the transition was officially complete, Bradley had inherited my clients' investment portfolios, their documented preferences, and their scheduled meetings. But the deeper relationships, the trust built through personal connection and genuine care, remained linked to me. I cleaned out my office for the final time, packing away 8 years of accumulated professional life. I realized that Bradley had gotten exactly what he thought he wanted. He had the accounts, the revenue stream, the recognition from senior management. What he didn't have was the one thing that couldn't be transferred through corporate documentation, the clients' hearts. And that, I was beginning to understand, might be enough. The morning after the transition was finalized, I woke up in what felt like a different world. For the first time in 8 years, I had no client meetings to prepare for, no market analyses to review, no urgent emails waiting in my inbox. The silence was both liberating and terrifying. Bradley had already left for the office by the time I came downstairs, probably eager to begin his first full day managing my former accounts. A note on the kitchen counter, written in his familiar handwriting, wished me luck with my new role and mentioned that he would be home late due to client dinners. Even his attempt at consideration felt like a patronizing pat on the head. I spent that first day doing something I hadn't done in years. I took care of myself. I went for a long walk in the park near our house, noticing trees and flowers that had been blooming outside my office window for months without my attention. I read a novel, fiction, not financial journals, for the first time since our honeymoon. I cooked an elaborate dinner, using recipes I'd bookmarked but never had time to try. But beneath this forced normalcy, I was planning. The demotion to research support had been intended as punishment, but it also granted me something valuable: invisibility. As a senior account manager, my every move had been scrutinized, my client interactions monitored, my professional decisions subject to review by senior partners. As a research analyst, I would be expected to work quietly in the background, generating reports that others would present, conducting analyses that would feed into strategies I wouldn't be credited with developing. They had made me invisible, but they had also made me free. My new office was a cubicle in the research department, positioned between two junior analysts who treated me with a mixture of sympathy and confusion. Sarah Patterson, fresh out of college with an economics degree and boundless enthusiasm, couldn't understand why someone with my experience was working alongside entry-level staff. Marcus Chen, a methodical researcher who specialized in sector analysis, seemed to grasp that my presence represented some kind of corporate politics he was wise to avoid. "I heard you used to manage the Henderson Group," Sarah whispered during my first week, as if acknowledging my former status might somehow be inappropriate. "That's like a $50 million account, right?" "Something like that," I replied, focusing on the market volatility report I was preparing. It was strange to analyze the same sectors I had once presented to clients personally, knowing that my insights would now be filtered through Bradley's interpretations. But the research role gave me access to something I hadn't anticipated: information. As a senior account manager, I had been focused on my specific clients and their portfolios. As a research analyst, I was expected to understand broad market trends, analyze competitor strategies, and identify emerging opportunities across the entire financial services industry. Within days, I was reading internal reports from departments I'd never interacted with before. Risk management assessments that revealed which clients were most vulnerable to market downturns. Compliance reviews that detailed regulatory concerns affecting various investment strategies. Strategic planning documents that outlined the firm's expansion goals and potential acquisition targets. More importantly, I had access to client satisfaction surveys and performance metrics that painted a detailed picture of how every account manager in the firm was actually performing. The data was supposed to be confidential, available only to senior management, but research analysts needed broad access to conduct comprehensive market analyses. What I discovered in those files would have been shocking if I hadn't already suspected the truth. Bradley's success had been built almost entirely on work that originated from other people. The innovative investment strategies credited to his name consistently traced back to research conducted by junior analysts, insights developed by other account managers, or ideas that had emerged from collaborative team projects. Even more revealing were the client satisfaction scores. Bradley's ratings were consistently average, not terrible, but hardly exceptional. His clients appreciated his communication skills and professional demeanor, but they frequently noted that his recommendations lacked the depth and personalization they had come to expect from the firm. Mrs. Henderson's most recent survey, completed just 2 weeks after Bradley took over her account, included comments that made my heart ache. "Mr. Jerome seems knowledgeable, but he doesn't understand our family's values the way Ariel did. I miss having someone who remembered what Harold would have wanted." Similar patterns appeared across all my former accounts. The clients weren't dissatisfied enough to leave. Bradley was competent, and switching financial advisors was complicated and emotionally exhausting, but they were noticeably less engaged than they had been under my management. I compiled this information methodically, not yet sure how I would use it, but certain that knowledge was my most powerful weapon. While Bradley basked in his new status and increased salary, while Channing congratulated himself on a successful reorganization, while Camilla smugly observed the fruits of her conspiracy, I was building a comprehensive understanding of their vulnerabilities. The research department's location also provided an unexpected advantage: proximity to conversations that senior staff assumed were private. The cubicle farm sat directly below the executive conference room, and sound traveled through the building's ventilation system in ways that the architects had never intended. During senior partner meetings, fragments of conversation would drift down to our level: budget discussions, client concerns, strategic disagreements that revealed the fault lines in the firm's leadership. I learned that Jasmine Brooks was increasingly frustrated with her father's favoritism toward Bradley. I discovered that Eric Willard was concerned about client retention rates in the accounts that had been recently transferred. Most importantly, I found out that the firm was under regulatory review for several investment strategies that had generated impressive returns but might have violated disclosure requirements. Each piece of information went into my private files, a growing collection of intelligence that painted a picture of a company more fragile than its polished exterior suggested. Brooks and Associates projected success and stability, but underneath the surface, there were cracks that could be exploited by someone who understood where to apply pressure. 3 weeks into my new role, I received an unexpected phone call that would accelerate my timeline for revenge. Ariel? The voice was hesitant, apologetic. This is Mrs. Henderson. I hope you don't mind me calling you directly. I glanced around the research cubicle, making sure no one was listening. Of course not, Mrs. Henderson. How can I help you? Well, it's about Mr. Jerome. He's a lovely young man, but, she paused, searching for diplomatic words, I'm not sure he really understands what Harold and I were trying to accomplish. I was wondering if you might have time for coffee sometime, just to talk. As I agreed to meet with her, I realized that my carefully planted seeds were beginning to sprout. The relationships I had thought were lost were merely dormant, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again. Bradley might have my office, my title, and my accounts, but he didn't have what mattered most, the trust of people who needed someone who truly understood their hopes and fears. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The first cracks in Bradley's facade appeared exactly 3 weeks after he took over my accounts. I was working late in the research department, analyzing quarterly earnings reports, when I heard his voice echoing from the executive floor above. He was on a phone call, and his usual confident tone carried a note of strain I hadn't heard since his early days at the firm. Mrs. Henderson, I understand your concerns. His voice drifted down through the ventilation system, but I can assure you that our investment strategy for your portfolio is based on the most current market analysis available. I paused my typing, listening more intently. Through the thin walls and ductwork, I could hear only fragments of his side of the conversation, but the pauses between his responses were growing longer, more uncomfortable. No, of course, if you feel that way, we can certainly schedule another meeting to discuss your options. The defeat in his voice was unmistakable. Yes, I'll have Camilla call you tomorrow to arrange something. After he hung up, I heard the distinctive sound of a chair being pushed back forcefully, followed by what might have been a coffee mug hitting the wall. Bradley's famous composure was cracking under the pressure of managing relationships he didn't truly understand. The next morning brought confirmation of what I'd suspected. Sarah Patterson, the eager junior analyst who sat next to me, was buzzing with gossip she'd overheard from Camilla's assistant. Apparently, the Henderson Group is threatening to pull their account, she whispered, glancing around to make sure no senior staff were within earshot. Something about Bradley not understanding their family values or investment philosophy. Camilla was on the phone with them for like an hour yesterday trying to smooth things over. I nodded sympathetically while internally celebrating. Mrs. Henderson was doing exactly what I had hoped she would do, expressing her dissatisfaction in ways that created pressure on Bradley and, by extension, on the senior leadership who had orchestrated this transition.
But Mrs. Henderson wasn't the only account showing signs of strain. Over the following days, I began to notice patterns that would have been invisible to me as a senior account manager, but were crystal clear from my position in the research department. Marcus Chen mentioned that he'd been asked to prepare emergency risk assessments for several high-value accounts, always a sign that clients were expressing concerns about their investment performance or strategy. The compliance department requested updated documentation for accounts that had recently changed management, indicating potential regulatory scrutiny or client complaints. Most telling of all was the sudden increase in after-hours work happening on the executive floor. Lights stayed on late into the evening, voices carried tension that wasn't present during normal business hours, and the senior partners began holding impromptu meetings that weren't reflected on any official calendar. The breaking point came during my 4th week in research, when I witnessed a conversation that revealed just how badly Bradley was struggling with the responsibilities he'd stolen from me.
I had stayed late to finish a comprehensive analysis of emerging market trends, the kind of detailed research that had once informed my client recommendations directly, but now fed into reports that others would present. The building was mostly empty except for security and cleaning staff, creating the perfect acoustics for eavesdropping on conversations happening floors above me. "This isn't working, Channing," Eric Willard's voice carried clearly through the ventilation system. "The account transfers have created more problems than they've solved." "What specific problems?" Channing's response sounded defensive, as if he was already regretting decisions he'd been confident about just weeks earlier. "Three of our most stable clients are expressing dissatisfaction with their new account management. The Henderson Group is talking about moving to Steinberg and Associates. Mr. Davidson called this morning asking if there was any way to get Ariel back on his account." There was a long pause before Channing responded, and I could picture him rubbing his temples in the way he did when confronted with problems he hadn't anticipated. "What about Bradley? I thought he was handling the transition well." "Bradley is struggling," Eric said carefully. "He's technically competent, but he lacks the personal connection that these clients had come to expect. They're not just looking for investment advice. They want someone who understands their families, their values, their long-term goals beyond just portfolio performance." And Ariel provided that? Apparently more than we realized. These clients trusted her completely. They shared personal information that went far beyond financial planning. Bradley has the account data, but he doesn't have their confidence. I heard footsteps pacing above me, probably Channing walking his usual circuit around his office when he was processing difficult information. "What are you suggesting?" he asked finally. "I think we need to consider bringing Ariel back into a client-facing role. Maybe not full account management initially, but some kind of consulting position that allows her to maintain relationships with clients who specifically request her involvement." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, and I found myself holding my breath as I waited for Channing's response. "That would be complicated," he said slowly. "We just completed this reorganization. If we reverse course now, it looks like we don't know what we're doing. If we lose the Henderson Group and Davidson accounts, it's going to look like we definitely don't know what we're doing," Eric replied bluntly. "Those two accounts alone represent over $4 million in annual fees." $4 million in annual fees. The number represented not just revenue, but credibility, reputation, and the kind of client satisfaction that generated referrals and built long-term business success. Bradley had inherited accounts worth that much, but he was proving incapable of maintaining the relationships that made them valuable. "Let me think about it," Channing said finally. "In the meantime, see if you can schedule some damage control meetings. Maybe bring Ariel into a few client conversations as a research consultant or something. Test the waters." As their footsteps faded and the building returned to its evening quiet, I sat back in my cubicle chair with a smile I couldn't suppress. The plan I'd barely dared to hope for was beginning to materialize on its own. The relationships I'd built over 8 years of genuine care and attention were proving impossible to transfer, and the people who had pushed me out were starting to realize their mistake. Bradley had gotten exactly what he thought he wanted: my accounts, my status, my recognition. But success in relationship-based businesses couldn't be stolen. It had to be earned through trust, understanding, and authentic connection. He was about to learn that lesson the hard way, and I was perfectly positioned to watch it happen. The phone call from Eric Willard came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 5 weeks after my demotion to the research department. His voice carried the kind of carefully controlled tension that preceded difficult conversations, the tone of someone trying to maintain authority while asking for help from someone they'd recently wronged. "Ariel, do you have a few minutes to talk in my office?" I looked around the research cubicle that had become my professional prison, noting how my colleagues suddenly found their computer screens fascinating when senior management appeared. "Of course, Eric. Should I bring anything specific?" "Just yourself. We'll keep this informal." The walk to Eric's office felt like ascending from exile back toward relevance. The executive floor still intimidated me, not because of its mahogany paneling or expensive artwork, but because it represented everything I'd lost. Yet today, for the first time since my fall from grace, I was being invited back, not as a supplicant, but as someone whose expertise was needed. Eric's office faced west, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city skyline. He gestured toward one of the leather chairs across from his desk, the same setup where I'd received praise and promotions in years past. But today felt different, more desperate, less assured. "Ariel, I'll be direct," he began, his hands folded on the desk in a pose that suggested prayer more than authority. "We're having some challenges with several client accounts that were recently transferred to new management." I waited, keeping my expression neutral while my heart raced with anticipation. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the opportunity I'd hoped would eventually arise from the chaos of Bradley's inevitable failures. "The Henderson Group, specifically," Eric continued, "has expressed significant concerns about their current account management. They're threatening to move their portfolio to Steinberg and Associates unless we can address their concerns." "I'm sorry to hear that," I replied, injecting just enough sympathy into my voice to seem genuine without appearing eager. "Mrs. Henderson can be particular about her service expectations." "That's actually why I wanted to speak with you. She specifically asked if there was any way you could be involved in their account management, even in a consulting capacity." Eric paused, clearly uncomfortable with having to ask for help from someone his reorganization had demoted. "I was wondering if you might be willing to participate in some client meetings as a research consultant." The request was exactly what I had anticipated, but I let the silence stretch for a moment, as if I were carefully considering the implications. In reality, I was savoring the irony of being asked to rescue the very accounts that had been stolen from me. "I'd be happy to help where I can," I said finally, though I should mention that I've been having informal conversations with several former clients who've reached out to me directly. They seem to be struggling with the transition to new account management. Eric's eyebrows rose slightly. "Informal conversations?" "Coffee meetings, mostly. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Davidson, a few others. They wanted to stay in touch, and I didn't think it would be appropriate to refuse their invitations." I paused delicately. "I hope that doesn't create any complications." No, of course not," Eric said quickly, though I could see him mentally calculating the implications. If clients were reaching out to me independently, it suggested their dissatisfaction with Bradley was deeper than he'd realized. What kinds of concerns are they expressing? I had prepared for this question extensively, knowing that my response would determine how much leverage I could gain from this conversation. "Mostly relationship issues," I said carefully. "They feel like their new account manager doesn't fully understand their personal circumstances and long-term goals. These aren't just investment accounts to them. They're family legacies, retirement security, philanthropic visions. They need someone who remembers their stories, not just their portfolio allocations." Eric nodded slowly, and I could see understanding dawn in his eyes. The reorganization had treated client relationships like transferable assets. But relationships weren't assets. They were living connections that required continuous nurturing and authentic care. "Would you be willing to take on a more formal consulting role?" he asked. "Something that would allow you to work directly with clients who request your involvement?" This was the opening I'd been waiting for, but I knew I had to negotiate carefully. Appearing too eager would diminish my bargaining position, while being too resistant might cost me the opportunity entirely. "I'd need to understand the scope and expectations," I said. "And honestly, Eric, I'd want some assurance that this isn't just a temporary measure to calm upset clients. If I'm going to rebuild relationships that have been damaged by this transition, I need to know that the firm is committed to supporting that work long term." What would that support look like? I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, analyzing what I would need to not just succeed, but to position myself for even greater success than I'd enjoyed before my fall. A proper office, not a cubicle in research, direct access to client files and portfolio management systems, the authority to make investment recommendations without having them filtered through other account managers, and, I paused for emphasis, a compensation structure that reflects the value of the relationships I'll be managing. What would that support look like? I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, analyzing what I would need to not just succeed, but to position myself for even greater success than I'd enjoyed before my fall. A proper office, not a cubicle in research, direct access to client files and portfolio management systems, the authority to make investment recommendations without having them filtered through other account managers, and, I paused for emphasis, a compensation structure that reflects the value of the relationships I'll be managing. Eric was quiet for a long moment, probably calculating the cost of my demands against the cost of losing major accounts. Finally, he spoke with the tone of someone who had already made his decision but needed to maintain the appearance of consideration. I'll need to discuss this with Channing, but I think we can work something out. The immediate priority is preventing client defections, and if you can help us do that, he trailed off, the implication clear. I can start immediately, I said, allowing myself a small smile. Mrs. Henderson is expecting my call this afternoon about setting up a strategy review meeting. As I walked back to my research cubicle, I felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with professional vindication and everything to do with strategic victory. They had pushed me out, thinking they could steal my work and discard my relationships. Now they were begging me to come back and save them from the consequences of their own short-sightedness. But this wasn't just about getting my old job back. This was about positioning myself for something much better. A role where my unique value would be undeniable, where my relationships with clients would make me indispensable, and where the people who had betrayed me would have to watch me succeed beyond their ability to undermine. The student had become the master, and class was about to begin. The disaster that would ultimately destroy Bradley's carefully constructed reputation began with something as mundane as a missed phone call. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I had just finished my first official client meeting as a relationship consultant, a hastily created title that allowed the firm to save face while acknowledging that my expertise was essential for client retention. Mrs. Henderson had been radiant during our meeting, her relief at having me back in her financial planning process so obvious that even Bradley, who sat stiffly in the corner taking notes, couldn't miss it. She had spent 20 minutes explaining concerns about her portfolio that she'd been trying to communicate to Bradley for weeks, concerns that made perfect sense once you understood her late husband's vision for their family foundation. Ariel gets it, she had said, directly to Bradley, with the kind of gentle reproach that was more devastating than outright criticism. After the meeting, as Mrs. Henderson gathered her papers and prepared to leave, she had quietly pressed a business card into my hand. "Dr. Margaret Foster," she whispered, "Harold's niece. She's been thinking about moving her medical practice's retirement fund. She specifically asked me to introduce her to the woman who helped Uncle Harold's dream come true." A referral, the most valuable currency in financial services, and it was flowing to me rather than to Bradley, despite his official role as Mrs. Henderson's account manager. As I slipped the card into my purse, I caught Bradley's expression in my peripheral vision, a mixture of confusion and growing alarm that told me he was beginning to understand just how much trouble he was actually in. But Mrs. Henderson's referral was nothing compared to what happened next. That same afternoon, while I was still savoring the small victory of the successful client meeting, Bradley made the mistake that would expose just how fundamentally he misunderstood the business he was trying to dominate. It started with a phone call from James Morrison, the son of our deceased client, whose estate planning I had handled with particular care during his father's final months. I wasn't supposed to know about the call, but the research department's location continued to provide unintended surveillance opportunities. Through the building's acoustic quirks, I could hear Bradley's side of what was clearly becoming a heated conversation. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your concern, but the investment strategy we've implemented is exactly what your father would have wanted." Bradley's voice carried that note of patronizing confidence that had charmed Channing, but was backfiring spectacularly with actual clients. There was a long pause, during which I imagined James Morrison explaining something that Bradley should have known, but clearly didn't. When Bradley spoke again, his voice had lost its assured tone. "Well, of course, if that's what the will specifies, but from a purely financial perspective." Another pause, longer this time. No, you're absolutely right. I should have reviewed those documents more carefully. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Bradley's responses becoming increasingly defensive and apologetic. When he finally hung up, I heard what sounded like a grown man putting his head in his hands and sighing, with the weight of someone who had just realized he was in over his head. The details of Bradley's mistake emerged over the following days through a combination of overheard conversations, worried discussions among the research staff, and carefully casual questions to Sarah Patterson, who had an extraordinary talent for collecting office gossip. What had happened was this. James Morrison's father had been one of my most thoughtful clients, a man who had spent years crafting an investment strategy that balanced financial growth with social responsibility. His will contained specific instructions about how his estate should be managed, including restrictions on certain types of investments and requirements for regular charitable distributions. These instructions weren't just legal obligations, they were the philosophical foundation of everything the Morrison family represented. When I had managed the account, I had understood this instinctively, weaving the family's values into every investment decision and treating the estate not just as a portfolio to be optimized, but as a reflection of a man's deepest beliefs about how wealth should be used. Bradley, working from the official client files that contained financial data but not emotional context, had restructured the Morrison portfolio for maximum returns without considering the ethical constraints that governed the account. He had moved money into sectors that the family considered morally objectionable, eliminated charitable distributions to improve performance metrics, and essentially violated everything that had made the Morrison family trust Brooks and Associates in the first place. The phone call I had overheard was James Morrison discovering these changes and demanding immediate corrections. But the damage went beyond just portfolio adjustments. It struck at the heart of trust that took years to build and could be destroyed in a single conversation. "They're not just upset about the investments," Sarah whispered to me during our afternoon coffee break. "James Morrison told Eric that he's questioning whether the firm even looked at his father's will. He's talking about filing a complaint with the state regulatory board for fiduciary violations." A regulatory complaint? In the financial services industry, few things were more damaging than official allegations of fiduciary misconduct. Even if the charges were ultimately dismissed, the investigation process was public, expensive, and devastating to a firm's reputation. Client trust, already fragile in an industry built on managing other people's money, could evaporate overnight when regulatory authorities began asking questions about whether a firm could be trusted to honor its obligations. But the Morrison account wasn't Bradley's only problem. Over the following week, a pattern of similar mistakes began to emerge across all the accounts he had inherited from me. The Brennan Foundation discovered that their socially responsible investment mandate had been ignored in favor of higher-yielding but ethically problematic options. Mr. Davidson found out that his tax loss harvesting strategy had been abandoned, potentially costing him thousands in unnecessary tax liability. The Clearwater Group learned that their cash flow requirements for scholarship distributions had been overlooked in favor of illiquid investments that couldn't be easily converted when needed. Each mistake revealed the same fundamental problem. Bradley had focused on the technical aspects of portfolio management while completely missing the personal, ethical, and emotional factors that made each client relationship unique. He had treated these accounts like mathematical problems to be optimized rather than human stories to be honored. And with each discovered error, the clients didn't just lose faith in Bradley. They lost faith in the firm that had promised them continuity and expertise, but had instead delivered incompetence and indifference. The reckoning was coming, and Bradley was about to learn that in a relationship business, technical skill without emotional intelligence wasn't just inadequate, it was professionally suicidal. The emergency meeting was called for 7 a.m. on a Monday morning, the kind of early hour that Channing Brooks reserved for genuine crises. I learned about it through the building's gossip network, Sarah Patterson's boyfriend worked in IT and had been asked to set up the executive conference room's video system over the weekend to accommodate partners calling in from different time zones. From my cubicle in research, I could hear the hurried footsteps and tense voices of senior staff arriving earlier than usual, their conversations carrying fragments of damage control strategies and barely controlled panic. The acoustics of the building, which had served as my intelligence gathering system for weeks, now provided a front row seat to the firm's desperate attempts to contain the spreading disaster. The Morrison complaint was officially filed on Friday. Eric Willard's voice drifted down through the ventilation system as the meeting began. The State Regulatory Board is opening a formal investigation into our fiduciary practices. There was a long silence, the kind that follows news so bad that no one wants to be the first to speak. Finally, Channing's voice, sounding older and more strained than I'd ever heard it, responded with the carefully controlled tone of someone trying to maintain leadership while processing catastrophic news. What's the potential exposure? Best case scenario? A formal reprimand and increased oversight for the next 2 years. Worst case? Fines, license suspension, and a public investigation that destroys our reputation with every client we have. I could picture the faces around that conference table, senior partners who had built their careers on the firm's spotless reputation, now watching decades of careful relationship building threatened by Bradley's incompetence. The Morrison account wasn't just about one client. It was about the fundamental question of whether Brooks and Associates could be trusted to honor its fiduciary obligations. What about the other accounts? Jasmine Brooks asked, her voice carrying the particular frustration of someone whose family name was attached to the firm's reputation. Are we looking at additional complaints? The Brennan Foundation has requested a full audit of their portfolio management over the past 2 months, Eric replied. Mr. Davidson's attorney called Friday, asking for documentation of all investment decisions made on his behalf since the account transition. The Clearwater Group has scheduled a meeting for Wednesday to discuss their ongoing relationship with the firm. The euphemism was transparent. The Clearwater Group was preparing to fire Brooks and Associates, and Wednesday's meeting would be their opportunity to outline exactly why. In the financial services industry, losing a major nonprofit account didn't just mean lost revenue. It meant lost credibility with an entire network of philanthropic organizations that talk to each other regularly. How much are we talking about in total potential losses? Channing's question came out strained, as if he already knew the answer would be devastating. If we lose Henderson, Morrison, Brennan, Davidson, and Clearwater, we're looking at approximately $8 million in annual fees, plus the referral networks associated with each account. $8 million. The number hung in the air like smoke from a financial fire that was consuming everything Bradley had touched. But the real damage went beyond immediate revenue loss. It was about the ripple effects that would spread through the industry as word got out that Brooks and Associates couldn't be trusted with complex, high-value client relationships. There has to be something we can do, Ian Ackles said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone watching his life's work crumble. Actually, there might be, Eric replied, and I could hear him shifting papers, probably preparing to deliver news that he knew would be difficult for everyone to hear. I've had informal conversations with several of the affected clients. They've all expressed a willingness to reconsider their positions if we can address their concerns about account management. What kind of concerns? They want Ariel back as their primary relationship manager. The silence that followed this statement was so complete that I wondered if the ventilation system had somehow stopped carrying sound. Finally, Channing spoke with the careful precision of someone trying to process information that contradicted everything he thought he understood about the situation. You're saying these clients would stay if we reversed the recent reorganization? Not exactly, Eric replied. They're not interested in going backward. They want something new, a senior relationship management role that acknowledges Ariel's unique value in maintaining complex client relationships. They've essentially told me that they'll work with the firm, but only if she's their primary point of contact. I could imagine the expressions around that table as the full implications became clear. The reorganization that had been designed to elevate Bradley and marginalize me had backfired so completely that the clients were now demanding the exact opposite outcome. Not only was I not expendable, I was apparently the only person who could save the firm from the consequences of their own short-sighted politics. What about Bradley? Jasmine asked the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice directly. Bradley has demonstrated technical competence, Eric replied diplomatically, but he lacks the relationship management skills that these clients require. We could restructure his role to focus more on analytical support and portfolio optimization, areas where his skills are better suited. The euphemisms were flying thick now. Restructure his role meant demotion, analytical support meant research assistant, and areas where his skills are better suited meant anywhere that didn't involve direct client contact. Bradley was about to experience exactly what I had gone through, except his fall would be public, humiliating, and entirely deserved. And Ariel, have you discussed this possibility with her? Channing's voice carried a note of concern that might have been about my willingness to help, or about how much leverage I might demand in return for saving their careers. Preliminary conversations only, Eric replied. She's indicated that she'd be willing to take on expanded client responsibilities, but she'd want guarantees about her authority and compensation. And frankly, given what she's being asked to clean up, her demands are likely to be significant. As the meeting continued with discussions of damage control strategies and timeline pressures, I sat in my research cubicle with a satisfaction so profound it was almost spiritual. They had tried to destroy me, steal my work, and discard my relationships. Now they were begging me to save them from the disaster they had created. But this wasn't just about professional vindication anymore. This was about power, the power to dictate terms, to demand respect, and to ensure that what had happened to me could never happen again. The students were about to become the teachers, and I was going to make sure they never forgot the lessons I was about to give them. The first domino fell on Wednesday morning at exactly 9:47 a.m. I know the precise time because I was watching the lobby security monitors in the research department when 3 men in expensive suits walked through the main entrance carrying briefcases that screamed legal trouble and wearing expressions that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. Sarah Patterson, ever the office gossip collector, materialized at my cubicle within minutes. "Those are attorneys from Morrison, Klein & Associates," she whispered, her eyes wide with the excitement of someone witnessing genuine corporate drama. "They represent the Morrison estate. Word is they're here to formally terminate the account and collect all documentation related to the portfolio management since Bradley took over." But the Morrison attorneys weren't the only visitors that morning. By 11 a.m., representatives from the Brennan Foundation had arrived for what was officially described as a portfolio review meeting, but everyone understood was an exit interview. The Clearwater Group's board members followed at 1 p.m., their faces carrying the grim determination of people who had already made difficult decisions and were now executing them. From my research cubicle, I had a perfect view of the executive floor's escalating chaos. Senior partners hurried between conference rooms like emergency room doctors, triaging multiple disasters. Camilla moved through the hallways with the frantic energy of someone trying to manage communications for a company in crisis. Even the normally unflappable Eric Willard looked rattled as he shuttled between meetings, his usual calm professionalism replaced by barely controlled stress. The real drama, though, was happening in the numbers. Each departing client represented not just immediate revenue loss, but cascading damage to the firm's financial stability. The research department, with its access to internal financial reports, provided me with a front-row seat to the destruction that Bradley's incompetence had unleashed. The Brennan Foundation's departure eliminated $2.3 million in annual management fees and took with it their extensive network of philanthropic contacts who regularly sought investment advice. The Morrison estate's termination meant losing not just their current portfolio, but the family's expanding business interests and the referrals that came from managing a respected family's wealth across generations. But it was the Clearwater Group's decision that delivered the most devastating blow to the firm's reputation. As the largest nonprofit client, their departure would be noticed throughout the philanthropic community. Worse, their board chairman, Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, was known for her principled stance on fiduciary responsibility. Her public statements about why they were leaving would carry weight far beyond the immediate financial impact. The afternoon brought news that transformed the crisis from serious to potentially fatal. Ian Ackles, who had been trying to contain the damage through personal relationships and individual conversations, emerged from the Clearwater meeting looking like a man who had just witnessed a fatal accident. "They're not just leaving," he announced to the emergency session of senior partners that had assembled in the main conference room. "Dr. Hartman is planning to send a letter to every major nonprofit in the city explaining their decision. She's treating this as a cautionary tale about fiduciary responsibility and the importance of proper due diligence when selecting financial managers." The implications were staggering. In the nonprofit sector, reputation was everything. Organizations that manage donor funds were extraordinarily careful about their investment partners, knowing that any hint of impropriety or incompetence could jeopardize their own fundraising efforts. A public letter from someone as respected as Dr. Hartman wouldn't just cost Brooks & Associates' current clients, it would make acquiring new nonprofit accounts virtually impossible for years. By 4 p.m., the financial damage was becoming clear through internal reports that circulated among senior staff. The firm was looking at immediate losses of approximately $6.2 million in annual revenue, with potential long-term impacts that could triple that number as word spread through professional networks. But the money was only part of the problem. The regulatory investigation, triggered by the Morrison complaint, was attracting attention from industry publications and professional organizations. Phone calls were coming in from existing clients who had read about the investigation online and wanted reassurance about their own account management. The coup de grace came at 5:30 p.m. when Jasmine Brooks received a call from the managing partner of Steinberg & Associates, Brooks' primary competitor. The call was ostensibly professional courtesy, a heads-up that several former Brooks clients were inquiring about transferring their accounts. "They're not just poaching our departing clients," Jasmine reported to her father during an emergency meeting I could overhear from the research floor. "They're actively recruiting our remaining major accounts. They know we're vulnerable right now, and they're moving fast to capitalize on our problems." As the building emptied that evening, the executive floor remained lit and active. Senior partners who hadn't worked past 6 o'clock in years were now facing the prospect of all-night damage control sessions. The firm that had prided itself on stability and measured growth was now fighting for its survival. And at the center of it all was the growing recognition that their salvation lay with the woman they had tried to discard: me. The confrontation I had been anticipating for months finally arrived at 6:15 p.m. on a Thursday evening, 3 days after the disaster with the departing clients had reached critical mass. I was working late in the research department, reviewing market analyses that would inform the damage control strategies the senior partners were desperately trying to implement, when I heard familiar footsteps echoing through the nearly empty building. Bradley appeared at my cubicle entrance, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes carried the hollow look of someone who had been staring at the ruins of his career for 72 hours straight. But beneath the exhaustion, I could see something else: anger, resentment, and the dangerous desperation of a man who had finally realized he was drowning. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, his voice carrying a hardness I had never heard during our marriage. "Somewhere private." I looked around the empty research floor, noting that even the cleaning crew hadn't arrived yet. "This seems private enough. What did you want to discuss?" "You know exactly what I want to discuss." He moved closer to my desk, looming over me in a way that felt threatening rather than intimate. "You've been sabotaging me from the beginning, poisoning the clients against me, feeding them information that makes me look incompetent." The accusation was so far from the truth that I almost laughed. "Bradley, I haven't had to sabotage you. You've done a perfectly adequate job of that yourself. Missing ethical restrictions and client wills, ignoring investment mandates, restructuring portfolios without understanding the personal values that drive them." "That's bullshit, and you know it," he snapped, his carefully constructed professional facade finally cracking completely. "Those clients were perfectly satisfied with their portfolio performance until you started whispering in their ears. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Davidson, the Morrison family, they were all happy until you began your little coffee meetings and private conversations. I stood up slowly, meeting his eyes with the calm confidence of someone who held all the cards in a game he was still trying to understand. They were satisfied with returns, Bradley, but they were never happy with the service. There's a difference, and your inability to understand that difference is exactly why you're failing. I'm failing? His voice rose dangerously, and I was suddenly grateful that we were alone in the building. I'm failing because my own wife has been systematically destroying every relationship I try to build. You've been playing some sick revenge game ever since the reorganization, and now you're watching the firm burn down because your ego couldn't handle being reassigned. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. My ego? You stole my work for years, claimed credit for strategies I developed, manipulated senior management to get me demoted so you could take over accounts you had no ability to manage, and somehow I'm the one with the ego problem? I never stole anything from you, Bradley said, but his voice lacked conviction. We were partners. We shared everything. That's what marriage means. Marriage means mutual respect and support, not using your spouse as an invisible research assistant while you collect all the recognition. I moved around my desk, putting some distance between us while maintaining eye contact. You didn't stole my work, Bradley. You stole my identity, my professional reputation, and my future. And when that wasn't enough, you conspired with Camilla to fabricate performance issues that justified pushing me out entirely. At the mention of Camilla's name, something shifted in Bradley's expression, a flicker of guilt that confirmed what I had suspected all along. The conspiracy to destroy my career had been more extensive than I had even realized. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but the denial came too quickly, too defensively. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know about the manufactured client complaints that suddenly appeared in my file. I know about the performance reviews that painted me as difficult and uncooperative. I know about the private meetings where you and Camilla planned how to transfer my accounts to you while making it look like a natural business decision. Bradley's face had gone pale, but his anger was now mixed with something that looked like panic. Even if that were true, and I'm not saying it is, look what you've done in response. You've destroyed the firm. $8 million in lost revenue, regulatory investigations, our reputation in ruins. Was your revenge really worth all of that? I smiled, feeling a sense of completion that was better than any professional victory I had ever experienced. Bradley, you still don't understand. This isn't revenge. This is just competence finally being distinguished from manipulation. The clients didn't leave because I convinced them to. They left because you proved you couldn't provide the service they needed. So what happens now? He asked, his voice suddenly small and defeated. The senior partners want you back. They're willing to give you everything you asked for. Corner office, senior management position, whatever compensation you want. And me? I'll be lucky if they let me stay in research. The irony was perfect. Research isn't so bad, Bradley. You might even learn something about the business if you pay attention.
As he turned to leave, shoulders slumped in defeat, I felt not triumph, but a profound sense of justice finally being served. The man who had tried to steal my career was about to experience exactly what I had endured, except his fall was deserved, public, and final. The student had indeed become the teacher, and the lesson was finally complete. The phone calls began arriving at my personal number the morning after my confrontation with Bradley, each one a validation so profound it felt like the universe was finally correcting itself. The first came from Mrs. Henderson at 8:30 a.m., her voice trembling with the kind of emotion that comes from genuine relief. "Ariel dear, I just heard the wonderful news from Eric Willard. You're coming back to manage our accounts properly again." She paused, and I could hear her composing herself. "I can't tell you how grateful Harold's niece will be." Dr. Foster has been so worried about finding someone who would understand her practice's values the way you understood ours. The second call, 20 minutes later, came from James Morrison. His voice carried none of the anger that had characterized his conversations with Bradley, replaced instead by something approaching hope. "Miss Roan, I want to apologize for any inconvenience our family's situation may have caused you personally." Eric explained that the portfolio mismanagement issues we experienced weren't reflective of your work. He cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "If you're willing to work with us again, we'd like to discuss bringing the Morrison estate back to Brooks and Associates. My father always spoke highly of your integrity and understanding of our family's values." By noon, I had received 6 more calls, all from former clients, all expressing relief that I would be returning to client management, and several making referrals to colleagues and family members who were looking for trustworthy financial guidance. The network effects that Bradley had destroyed were rebuilding themselves, but now they were flowing directly to me, rather than through the firm's general reputation. But the most satisfying validation came from an unexpected source. At 2 p.m., my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Hartman from the Clearwater Group, the woman whose departure had dealt such a devastating blow to the firm's non-profit client base. "Miss Roan, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. Eric Willard provided your contact information and explained that you'll be resuming client relationship management." Her tone was professional but warm, the voice of someone who had done her research and liked what she had found. "I wanted to reach out because several members of our board remember your work on the Henderson Foundation account. We were impressed by your understanding of how investment strategy can support philanthropic mission." I held my breath, hardly daring to hope for what might come next. The Clearwater Group would be interested in discussing a return to Brooks and Associates, but only if you would be our primary relationship manager. "We need someone who understands that our investment returns aren't just about numbers, they're about our ability to fund scholarship programs that change young people's lives." The irony was perfect. The account that had fled due to Bradley's incompetence was now requesting to return specifically because of my involvement. Not only was I being vindicated, I was being elevated beyond even my previous status within the firm. The afternoon brought even more external validation, this time from industry sources. Margaret Chen, a senior editor at Financial Services Quarterly, called to discuss a story she was researching about the importance of relationship management in wealth advisory services. "I've been hearing remarkable things about your client retention approaches," she said, her journalist's instincts clearly intrigued by the story behind Brooks and Associates' recent troubles and recovery efforts. "Several industry contacts mentioned your name specifically when discussing best practices in high-net-worth client relationships. Would you be interested in being interviewed for a feature article?" A feature article, the kind of industry recognition that built reputations and attracted clients organically. The same kind of visibility that Bradley had tried to claim for himself was now being offered to me based on genuine professional respect, rather than political maneuvering. By 4 p.m., Eric Willard had called to inform me that 3 new potential clients had specifically requested meetings with me after hearing about my return from existing clients. The referral network that had been damaged by the firm's recent troubles was not only healing, it was growing stronger because it was now centered around authentic relationships rather than institutional reputation. The final validation of the day came in the form of a handwritten note, delivered by courier. The stationery was cream-colored and expensive, the kind used by people who understood the power of thoughtful gestures. The note was from Ian Ackles, my original mentor at the firm. "Ariel, I owe you an apology for not speaking up more forcefully during the reorganization. Your grace under pressure and dedication to your clients has been a masterclass in professionalism. The firm is lucky to have you back, and I'm looking forward to learning from your example as we rebuild what was nearly lost." As I sat in my apartment that evening, surrounded by notes from grateful clients, interview requests from industry publications, and referral opportunities from people who understood the value of authentic expertise, I realized that my vindication was complete. Not because I had destroyed Bradley's career, though that had been satisfying, but because the professional community had recognized and validated the principles I had never compromised. Trust, competence, and genuine care for clients' well-being had proven more valuable than political manipulation and stolen credit. The relationships I had built through years of honest service were now rebuilding not just my career, but elevating it beyond anything I had previously imagined possible. Tomorrow, I would return to the executive floor, not as a supplicant grateful for a second chance, but as someone whose expertise was genuinely indispensable. The corner office they offered me had floor-to-ceiling windows facing east, flooding the space with morning light that seemed to symbolize the new beginning I was about to embrace. It was larger than my previous office, with enough room for a proper meeting area where I could host the kind of intimate client conversations that had built my reputation. The mahogany desk was positioned to command a view of the city skyline, the same view that had once belonged only to senior partners. Channing Brooks himself escorted me through the space, his demeanor a mixture of humble gratitude and barely disguised relief. The man who had casually dismissed me months earlier now hung on my every word, seeking my approval for arrangements he clearly hoped would secure my commitment to saving his firm. "We've had it install a dedicated client portal system," he explained, gesturing toward the array of monitors that would give me real-time access to every aspect of my clients' portfolios. "You'll have full autonomy over investment decisions, with direct access to our trading systems. No more filtering recommendations through other managers, or waiting for approval on strategic changes." The authority he was describing went far beyond what I had possessed, even before the reorganization. This wasn't just a restoration of my previous position, it was an elevation to a level of independence and responsibility that reflected my true value to the organization. "The title we're proposing is Senior Director of Client Relationships," Eric Willard added, reading from a prepared document that outlined my new role. "You'll have oversight of all high-net-worth individual accounts and institutional clients who specifically request relationship-focused management. You'll also have the authority to hire and train junior staff who want to develop similar client relationship skills. A teaching role, the opportunity to mentor others in the authentic relationship-building approaches that had proven so successful. It was the kind of legacy-building position that would extend my influence throughout the firm, and potentially the entire industry. But it was the compensation package that truly reflected how dramatically my leverage had shifted. The base salary they proposed was 30% higher than what I had earned as a senior account manager. The performance bonuses were structured around client satisfaction metrics and retention rates rather than just portfolio returns, recognition that my value lay in maintaining relationships rather than simply generating profits. Most significantly, they were offering me equity in the firm, actual ownership shares that would give me a voice in strategic decisions, and a financial stake in the company's long-term success. It was the kind of partnership opportunity that was typically reserved for founding families and senior executives who had spent decades building the organization. "There's one more thing," Channing said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone preparing to deliver news that might be sensitive. "Given the recent challenges with account transitions, we think it would be beneficial to have someone with your expertise overseeing all future client relationship management changes. Essentially, you'd have veto power over any reorganization that might affect established client relationships."
Veto power. The authority to prevent anyone else from experiencing what had happened to me. It was more than just personal protection. It was the chance to institutionalize the principles of authentic client service that had guided my entire career. As I walked through my new office, testing the ergonomic chairs and admiring the view that stretched across the downtown financial district, I realized that this wasn't just a job offer. It was an acknowledgement of everything I had always believed about how business relationships should work. Trust, competence, and genuine care weren't just nice ideals. They were the foundation of sustainable success in any industry built on human connections. The woman who had once scrubbed floors in this very building was about to become one of its most powerful executives. Not through manipulation or political maneuvering, but through the simple act of being authentically excellent at work that mattered. The transformation was complete. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. 6 months later, I stood in that same corner office, watching the sunrise paint the city skyline in shades of gold and amber. The view from my window had become familiar now, a daily reminder of how far I had traveled from those dark nights when I pushed a cleaning cart through these same hallways, invisible and forgotten. The leather folder on my desk contained the quarterly client satisfaction reports that had just arrived from our external auditing firm. The numbers told a story that still amazed me. 98% client retention rate, the highest in the firm's history. New account acquisitions were up 40% compared to the same period last year, with 85% of new clients coming through referrals from existing relationships. Bradley's name appeared in the reports too, but in a very different context. He had found his place in the research department, where his analytical skills were genuinely valuable, and his work didn't require the emotional intelligence that had always eluded him. It wasn't the career he had envisioned for himself, but it was honest work that contributed to the firm's success without exploiting anyone else's contributions. We rarely spoke now, moving through the building like polite strangers who shared a past neither of us cared to revisit. The divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier, a quiet legal formality that dissolved what had already been destroyed by betrayal and ambition. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Henderson. Harold's great-niece just graduated medical school and wants to discuss investment planning for her new practice. I told her she has to meet with you. Some traditions should never be broken. I smiled, remembering the night I had discovered that hidden safe behind Bradley's desk, the safe that had never contained anything more damaging than his college transcripts and some old family photos. Sometimes the most powerful discoveries aren't about what we find in secret compartments, but about what we find in ourselves when everything else is stripped away. The real treasure had never been hidden behind a bookshelf in an executive office. It had been there all along, in the relationships I had built through years of genuine care, in the trust I had earned through competence and authenticity, and in the quiet strength I had never known I possessed until everything I thought I wanted was taken away. I had started this journey as a woman who lost everything. I was ending it as someone who had found something far more valuable, the knowledge that authentic excellence couldn't be stolen, transferred, or destroyed by those who didn't understand its true worth. Outside my window, the city was waking up to new possibilities, and so was I.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.